The torches flickered in the icy midnight wind, their flames bending like whispers of death as the guards dragged her towards the pit. The queen's jeweled crown had long been stripped from her head, her gown torn and muddied from the violence of betrayal. Once, she had been the most admired woman in court, powerful, radiant, untouchable. Now, she was nothing more than a condemned prisoner, marched towards a punishment so cruel that even the executioners dared not speak its name aloud. As the villagers gathered, silence hung heavy in the air. They had seen executions before, beheadings, burnings, hangings. But this? This was different. This was burial alive. A punishment reserved not for ordinary criminals, but for women of royal blood who had supposedly shamed their crowns. The queen's eyes darted wildly between the shadowy figures surrounding her. She had pleaded her innocence before the king, her husband, the very man who once swore eternal love at their wedding. But love had curdled into suspicion, and suspicion into rage. She was accused of treason, of plotting in secret, of unholy betrayals whispered through palace corridors. Yet no trial had been fair, no voice allowed to defend her. Her fate was already sealed. The earth awaited. A freshly dug hole, its edges sharp and damp, gaped like the open mouth of the underworld. The guards forced her to her knees, her trembling hands clawing at the dirt, her cries muffled by the night. Some in the crowd looked away, unable to watch. Others leaned closer, compelled by the horror. They knew this would be remembered not just as another execution, but as a spectacle, a queen swallowed alive by the very land she once ruled. The punishment was symbolic. Fire was for witches, steel was for traitors, but burial alive, that was for women who had broken the sanctity of royal honor. To silence them. To erase them. To condemn them to a suffocating death where not even their screams would escape the soil. As the first shovelfuls of earth rained down upon her, she let out a piercing scream, part fury, part terror. She screamed not just for her life, but for the injustice of it all. For the betrayal of a husband. For the cruelty of a court that had once bowed at her feet. For a history that would soon twist her name into scandal and shame. And then, as the dirt covered her face, darkness consumed her. A queen, buried alive, erased not by sword or fire, but by the silence of the earth. What led to such a punishment? Why did medieval rulers choose such unimaginable cruelty, and why was it inflicted most often on women of power? To understand, we must journey into the twisted world of medieval justice, superstition, and the politics of fear. To understand why a queen could meet such a horrifying fate, we must step back into the mindset of medieval Europe, a world where punishment was not only about justice but also about public symbolism and control. Every execution carried a message. Every method of death reflected the crime in society's eyes. In the medieval imagination, burial alive was one of the most terrifying punishments imaginable. Unlike the swiftness of the sword or the cleansing fire of the stake, burial was slow, suffocating, and silent. It was not only a physical death but also a symbolic erasure, a way to hide the condemned beneath the earth, as if they had never existed at all. This punishment was particularly linked to betrayals of chastity, fidelity, and honor, crimes that society believed were uniquely tied to women. Where men were executed by steel for treason, women were often buried alive if accused of adultery, infidelity, or dishonoring the crown. The logic was brutal: if a woman had soiled her body, then that body must be swallowed whole by the soil. Historians trace its origins back to ancient traditions. In Roman law, Vestal virgins, women sworn to eternal chastity in service of the gods, faced live burial if they broke their vows. The logic was chilling: their blood could not be spilled, for they were sacred, yet their sin demanded punishment. So they were entombed underground, given just a lamp and a loaf of bread, left to suffocate in darkness. This practice seeped into medieval Europe, twisted and repurposed by monarchs who wanted both cruelty and spectacle. By the Middle Ages, burial alive had become the honorable form of execution for women of high status. Burning was considered too vulgar for queens and noblewomen. Hanging was too common, too degrading. But burial? That was clean. It allowed rulers to punish with severity while maintaining a warped sense of dignity. After all, a lady's blood was not spilled, her body not displayed in flames, she simply vanished beneath the earth, as though swallowed by history itself. The punishment was also deeply connected to fear of female power. Queens were not just wives, they were political players, sometimes wielding more influence than kings themselves. If a queen was accused of betrayal, whether true or fabricated, her death was meant to send a message: no woman, no matter how crowned or adored, could escape submission to the authority of her husband and her king. It is important to remember that many of these accusations were political. A queen who became inconvenient, too powerful, or simply disliked could suddenly face charges of witchcraft, adultery, or treason. And with those charges came the sentence of burial alive, a punishment designed not just to kill the woman, but to bury her legacy, her story, and her voice. Thus, when we hear of queens buried alive, we are not only hearing of executions but also of the machinery of medieval politics. The grave was not dug for justice, it was dug for control. But who were these queens, these women of power who found themselves condemned to such a fate? And how did their stories echo through history, often twisted into cautionary tales? That is where we now turn, to the queens themselves, and the darkest stories of their wedding nights, betrayals, and ultimate burials. When we imagine medieval queens, we often see glittering crowns, rich gowns, and palaces filled with splendor. But beneath the gold and jewels lay a brutal truth: the crown was a cage, and one wrong move could turn a queen's wedding bed into her grave. Among the most infamous cases whispered in chronicles is that of Agnes Bernauer, a commoner who married into royalty in 15th-century Bavaria. Though not born a queen, her marriage to Duke Albrecht made her a threat to the nobility. The court despised her for her humble origins, branding her a seductress who had bewitched the young duke. Her crime? Daring to love a prince. The punishment? Death by drowning in the Danube, a watery burial that mirrored the earth's suffocating embrace. Agnes's fate became a chilling warning: even love itself could be treasonous if it challenged dynastic power. Another tale comes from Romania's medieval courts, where chronicles describe noble women accused of adultery being walled up alive within monasteries. These stoned burials were considered merciful compared to burning, but they were slow, torturous deaths. The women were sealed into chambers with no escape, left to starve in silence, their prayers echoing in darkness until even the stones seemed to swallow them. Some accounts suggest that queens, accused of betraying their kings, were given this fate in secret, punished not publicly but erased quietly, their names stricken from records. The specter of England's Anne Boleyn also looms in this narrative. Though she was beheaded rather than buried alive, her story reveals the same deadly machinery at work. She had risen too high, wielded too much influence, and when she could no longer provide the king what he demanded, a son, she was accused of adultery and treason. Execution was inevitable. But whispers from her time say some in the court argued for burial alive instead, a fate deemed fitting for a queen accused of corrupting her marriage bed. Had history turned slightly differently, Anne's grave might not have been above ground at all. In German chronicles of the Middle Ages, we find even more chilling records: noble women, sometimes even abbesses or queens' consorts, condemned for supposed witchcraft. Their punishment was not fire, for that was the death of peasants, but burial. In these cases, being of royal blood did not save them. On the contrary, it made their fall even more symbolic. To bury a queen alive was to bury her crown, her dynasty, her influence. These stories are scattered, fragmented, sometimes cloaked in legend. Yet the pattern is undeniable. Whether in Bavaria, England, or the eastern courts of Europe, burial alive was the chosen punishment for women who stepped outside the narrow lines drawn for them. It was not just death, it was annihilation. Their very names were often erased, leaving us with only fragments, half-whispered tales of queens and consorts who vanished beneath the soil. And yet, their stories did not fully disappear. Rumors spread, ballads were sung, and even centuries later, historians still chase the shadows of these women. Each tale reminds us of the cruelty hidden behind the pomp of medieval courts. The crown may have glittered, but beneath it, the earth was always waiting. For most young brides, a wedding night might have been filled with nervous anticipation, fear of the unknown, and whispered promises of love. But for medieval queens, the wedding night was something else entirely. It was a trial, one that could determine whether they lived in the safety of a crown or faced the slow suffocation of a grave. In the medieval courts of Europe, a queen's worth was tied almost entirely to her body. On the night of her marriage, she was expected to prove her virginity. This wasn't just between her and her husband, sometimes the entire court awaited the results. In France, Spain, and England, royal bedding ceremonies were often attended by witnesses or chambermaids who inspected the blood-stained sheets, proof of consummation. Failure to provide this proof could mean accusations of impurity, witchcraft, or deceit. And for queens, such accusations were deadly. If the queen failed this test, suspicion turned immediately to her loyalty. Was she already corrupted? Had she betrayed her king even before the marriage? Medieval chroniclers record cases where rumors alone led to brutal punishments. In some regions, if a queen was accused of entering marriage dishonored, the punishment prescribed was being buried alive, her wedding night transforming into her death sentence. Imagine the terror: a young queen, perhaps only 14, trembling on her wedding bed, not only fearing the physical ordeal but also knowing that one misstep, one accusation, could doom her forever. The candles flickered in the chamber, but in her mind, the shadows of the grave were already there. The bed became a coffin, the sheets a shroud. One of the most chilling examples comes from the Eastern courts. Chronicles describe brides being subjected to invasive examinations by midwives or elder women of the court before the marriage was consummated. If any doubt arose about her purity, the punishment was swift and merciless. Burial alive was not merely execution, it was symbolic. It declared that a woman's failure to be pure meant she was unworthy of both love and air itself. Even worse, political enemies often used these wedding night trials as weapons. A rival noble could spread a whisper, "The queen did not bleed," or "The sheets were clean," and that was enough to seal her fate. No court of law, no trial, just a sentence carried out in the dark of night, where stone walls or earth itself became her eternal prison. Thus, the medieval wedding night was not the beginning of love for these women, it was the beginning of judgment. They lay down not as brides but as accused prisoners, and some never rose again. It is this cruel transformation, the turning of a sacred union into a death ritual, that makes the stories of medieval queens so haunting. For them, the line between the bridal bed and the burial pit was razor thin. It is tempting to believe that burial alive was simply the product of cruel superstition. But the truth is darker, these punishments were weapons of politics. Queens were not just wives, they were pawns, bargaining chips, and potential threats to dynasties. Every move they made had consequences far beyond the private chambers of a palace. Marriage in the medieval world was rarely about love. For kings, queens were chosen as tools of diplomacy. A French princess might be sent to England to secure a truce, a Spanish bride might be offered to a German prince to cement an alliance. The queen's body, therefore, became a living treaty. Her womb was the battlefield where heirs would be forged, ensuring dynasties survived. If she failed, if she faltered, her existence threatened not only her husband's pride but the entire stability of the realm. This is why accusations of impurity, infidelity, or infertility were so devastating. A barren queen could destabilize succession. A rumored affair could call the legitimacy of future heirs into question. For kings and their councils, the solution was brutal but effective: eliminate the queen. And to bury her alive was to send a message, a ritual that erased not only her life but her influence, silencing her forever. We see echoes of this political calculation in the fate of queens across Europe. When Isabella of Angoulême, the wife of King John of England, was rumored to have entertained lovers, the whispers nearly plunged the crown into chaos. Though she escaped burial, other queens in less powerful courts were not so fortunate. Chronicles from Eastern Europe reveal noble consorts sealed into convent walls, their existence erased, so that the king could marry again without scandal. In many cases, the accusations themselves were politically fabricated. If a king desired a new bride to strengthen his alliances, he needed an excuse to rid himself of the old one. Instead of open execution, which could anger her powerful family abroad, burial alive offered secrecy. The queen disappeared quietly, her family left with rumors but no body to bury, no martyr to rally around. These punishments also reinforced patriarchal power. By burying a king reminded the court that even the highest-born woman had no true autonomy. She was valuable only as long as she served her husband's will and the state's needs. The horror was not only personal, it was symbolic. Every burial alive was a performance of dominance, a warning to courtiers, to women, to rival dynasties: the crown could crush anyone. Thus, medieval queens lived in a paradox. They were elevated above all other women, draped in jewels and ceremony, yet they were also the most vulnerable. Their crowns were fragile, their thrones built on shifting sands of politics. A rumor could become a weapon, and a bridal bed could transform into a graveyard. The cruelty of burying queens alive was never just about morality or superstition. It was about power, who controlled it, who threatened it, and how ruthlessly it could be defended. To truly understand why queens were so vulnerable, we need to look beyond politics and into the belief systems of the medieval world. Kings may have used burial alive as a political weapon, but the soil in which that weapon grew was superstition, myth, and fear, all of which cast queens as dangerous, almost otherworldly figures. In medieval Europe, women were seen through the lens of religion, and much of that lens was unforgiving. The biblical story of Eve was constantly invoked, a reminder that a woman's weakness had once doomed all of mankind. Priests and theologians warned that women were the gateway of the devil, more susceptible to sin, lust, and betrayal. And when a woman was not just any woman, but a queen, her perceived power over a king's body and mind was seen as a threat to the stability of God's ordained order. This is why the queen's purity mattered so much. A chaste, obedient queen symbolized divine order. An impure or rebellious queen was painted as an agent of chaos, capable of bringing God's wrath upon the kingdom. When disasters struck, a famine, a plague, or a lost battle, whispers often spread that the queen was cursed, or worse, a witch. And in a society desperate to assign blame, such whispers could be deadly. Burial alive was more than execution. It was ritual. To place a woman beneath the earth was to return her to dust, cleansing the realm of her supposed corruption. Unlike beheading, which created martyrs, burial erased her completely, no body to venerate, no tomb to honor, just silence. This matched medieval superstition. A queen who threatened the natural order had to be swallowed by it, consumed by the very soil she had corrupted. But myths also played their part. Tales spread of queens who bewitched kings with potions, who secretly poisoned rivals, or who used their beauty to control entire courts. Chroniclers often exaggerated these stories, weaving queens into legends of femme fatale who lured kingdoms to ruin. The more dangerous these stories made them seem, the more justified their brutal punishments appeared. Even the wedding night itself became tangled in superstition. Blood on the sheets wasn't just proof of virginity, it was seen as a sacred omen. It meant the marriage was blessed, fertile, and pure. If that omen failed to appear, it wasn't just the queen who was judged, it was believed that the kingdom itself might fall under a curse. And so, the punishment of burying a queen alive became a grotesque ritual of protection, ensuring that divine favor remained with the crown. The irony, of course, was that these myths and superstitions were carefully maintained by the very men who benefited from them. Clerics, advisors, and kings reinforced the belief that a queen could bring ruin if not kept under control. Fear of women, especially powerful women, was turned into a tool, and burial alive was its ultimate expression. Thus, medieval culture trapped queens in a cycle of fear. If they were obedient, they were trophies. If they showed defiance, they became monsters. And in both cases, their lives could end beneath the soil, sacrificed to superstition disguised as justice. Not every queen who faced the shadow of burial alive met her fate beneath the earth. Against all odds, a few managed to survive, through wit, diplomacy, or sheer luck. Their stories are less told, yet they reveal the fragile line between horror and survival in the medieval world. One such queen was Joan of Navarre, stepmother to Henry V of England. She was accused of witchcraft, whispered to have cast spells against her stepson to weaken his reign. In an age where such accusations could easily lead to burial alive, Joan seemed doomed. But she was clever. Instead of denying the charges outright, she appealed to her royal connections abroad, reminding the English crown that her execution would insult powerful allies in France. By shifting the danger from herself to the kingdom, she avoided death, though she spent years in harsh confinement. Another striking example comes from Eastern Europe. Chronicles speak of a young consort who was accused of treason after failing to produce an heir. Her enemies demanded that she be buried alive within a convent wall, a fate reserved for disgraced noblewomen. But the queen bribed her guards with family jewels, escaping in disguise under the cover of night. She fled across borders, her story retold in whispers as proof that even the cruelest punishments could be defied. Though her name was lost in official history, her legend lived on in local ballads. Even in Western Europe, there were queens who navigated danger with strategy. Catherine of Aragon, though not threatened with burial alive, faced the humiliation of being cast aside by Henry VIII. She fought back not with armies but with persistence, refusing to concede that her marriage was invalid. In doing so, she avoided execution and lived out her days with dignity, though stripped of her title. Her survival showed that even within suffocating systems, resistance was possible. What linked these women was their ability to turn the tools of power back on their oppressors. Where kings used politics, they used politics in return. Where kings sought to erase them, they found ways to ensure their stories endured, whether through alliances, secret negotiations, or sheer defiance. Their survival also reveals an uncomfortable truth: these queens lived not because justice protected them, but because they played the game better than their enemies. For every queen who escaped, dozens more were silenced forever. But the very existence of survivors created cracks in the system. They showed other women, and even sympathetic courtiers, that resistance was not impossible. Over time, such stories planted seeds of change. The more queens who resisted and survived, the harder it became to justify their ritual erasure. Their lives, fragile, threatened, and yet enduring, stood as living rebukes to the cruelty of burial alive. They were not just survivors. They were reminders that power, even in its most ruthless form, could never completely silence the human will to live. The stories of medieval queens buried alive are more than fragments of grim history. They are mirrors, reflecting how fear, superstition, and power combined to silence women who dared to step beyond their prescribed roles. Though centuries have passed, their legacy still lingers in the way we think about authority, gender, and justice. One of the most powerful lessons is that violence against women has always been political. Queens were not buried alive because of crimes they committed, but because of what they represented: influence, independence, and the ability to sway kingdoms. Their punishments were a warning to all women: stay silent, or risk being swallowed by the earth itself. In many ways, these stories remind us that controlling women's bodies and choices has long been a tool of maintaining male dominance. Yet there is also resilience in this legacy. The queens who resisted, who found ways to survive or ensure their names were remembered, show that even in the darkest systems, there is room for defiance. Their stories ripple forward, giving us inspiration today. When we hear about women silenced in politics, in workplaces, or in societies around the world, we are witnessing echoes of those medieval battles for voice and dignity. Modern historians now reinterpret these horrors not as mere scandals, but as symbols of systemic oppression. The image of a queen entombed alive is no longer a tale of royal justice, but a reminder of what happens when unchecked power goes unquestioned. These re-examinations also challenge us: are there ways in which we, too, bury truths alive? Do we silence stories, erase inconvenient voices, or let superstition shape our judgments in the modern world? There is also a deeper cultural lesson. Burial alive was meant to erase women completely: body, voice, memory. But ironically, these stories have survived. Centuries later, we speak their names, tell their tales, and draw meaning from their suffering. What was meant to be obliteration became preservation. Their silence became a warning that echoes louder than their oppressors ever imagined. Finally, these horrors remind us of the cost of fear-driven societies. When superstition is stronger than compassion, when myth is stronger than truth, and when power is used only to protect itself, the innocent always suffer. By remembering the queens who were unjustly punished, we remind ourselves never to repeat such cruelties. So when we look back on these medieval queens, some buried, some silenced, some who endured, we see not just victims of a brutal age, but voices that survive through history. Their legacy tells us that even when the world tries to bury truth alive, truth has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring lesson: no soil, no stone, no silence can ever fully erase the human will to be remembered.